Most of the time, you don't question your thoughts. You don't stop and examine where they came from, or whether they're accurate. You experience them, and almost immediately you accept them, not consciously, not deliberately, but automatically. They appear, and they feel true. A thought enters your mind, and within seconds it begins shaping how you feel. It influences your perspective, your reactions, your attention. And all of that happens before you've had time to step back and evaluate it. That's what makes this so difficult to notice. The belief happens instantly. It doesn't feel like belief. It feels like recognition, like something that is already true, something you're simply becoming aware of. But if you look closely, that process is happening too quickly to be deliberate. The thought appears, and the belief follows almost immediately. There is no clear separation between the two, and because there is no separation, it feels like the thought and the truth are the same thing, like whatever appears in your mind must be valid in some way. But that assumption is where the pattern begins. Your brain is designed to prioritize efficiency. It doesn't analyze every piece of information in detail before responding to it. It relies on patterns, shortcuts, and previous experience to make fast judgments. And this applies to your thoughts just as much as anything else. When a thought appears, your brain doesn't treat it as something neutral by default. It immediately interprets it based on what it already knows. It assigns meaning, relevance, and emotional weight almost instantly. This is why thoughts feel convincing. Not because they've been proven, but because they've been processed quickly. Your brain has already categorized them, already placed them into a framework that feels familiar. And that familiarity creates trust. It makes the thought feel like something that fits, something that makes sense, something that doesn't need to be questioned. So instead of evaluating the thought, your mind moves forward with it. It accepts it as a starting point, and everything that follows on that initial acceptance. And that's how belief becomes automatic. There is also a strong connection between belief and feeling. When a thought carries emotion, it becomes much harder to question. Because emotion doesn't just sit alongside the thought, it reinforces it. It gives it weight, urgency, and presence. If a thought creates anxiety, it feels important. If it creates doubt, it feels meaningful. If it creates tension, it feels like something that needs attention. And your brain uses that emotional signal as evidence. It assumes that if something feels this strong, it must be true, or at least true enough to take seriously. And because of that, the thought is accepted even more quickly. This is why emotionally charged thoughts are the hardest to step away from. They don't just exist as ideas, they feel like something happening to you in real time. And that feeling makes them difficult to question. But the feeling is part of the process. It's not proof of the thought, it's reinforcement. Another reason you believe your thoughts is because they are presented in your own voice. They sound like you. They use your language, your tone, your patterns of thinking. And because of that, they feel like something you are saying to yourself. That familiarity creates immediate trust. It doesn't feel like information coming from somewhere else. It feels internal, personal, connected to who you are, and that makes it much harder to separate yourself from it. But the voice itself is part of the illusion. Your brain uses what it knows to construct thoughts in a way that feels recognizable. It presents them in a format that feels natural, even though the process that created them is automatic. So when a thought appears, it feels like something you intended, like something you chose. But in reality, it was generated and then presented to you in a familiar form. And that familiarity is what makes it so easy to believe. What makes this pattern so consistent is how quickly belief attaches itself to a thought. There isn't a clear moment where you decide to believe it. The thought appears, and belief is already there, almost fused to it. It doesn't feel like two separate steps. It feels like a single event. That fusion removes any space for evaluation. By the time you become aware of the thought, it already feels valid. It already feels like something you should take seriously, and because of that, your mind moves forward with it instead of questioning it. Once you start engaging with the thought, that engagement reinforces the belief. You analyze it, expand it, connect it to other ideas, and all of that makes it feel more structured, more developed, more real. And that added structure strengthens the sense that it must be true. but the structure is built after the belief has already taken hold. It's not evidence that the thought is correct. It's the result of your attention shaping it. And because that shaping happens automatically, it feels like the thought arrived fully formed and fully valid, even though it was constructed in real time. Your brain also has a tendency to favor consistency over accuracy. It prefers thoughts that align with patterns it already recognizes. If a thought fits into something familiar, something you've considered before, something that matches a past experience, it is accepted more easily. This means that repeated thoughts become more believable over time. Not because they have been verified, but because they have been repeated. Each repetition reduces resistance, making the thought feel more natural, more expected, more aligned with how you already think, and that familiarity lowers your guard. You don't question the thought as much, because it feels like something you've already understood. It doesn't feel new or uncertain. It feels like something that belongs. This is why certain thoughts feel automatically true. They've been reinforced enough times that your brain no longer treats them as something that needs evaluation. It treats them as something that is already established. And once that happens, belief becomes the default response, not a conscious decision. There is also a momentum effect that strengthens belief. When a thought is followed by another thought that supports it, and then another, it creates a chain that feels logical. Each step seems to confirm the one before it, even if the entire chain is based on an initial assumption that was never questioned. That sequence feels like reasoning. It feels like you are thinking something through, arriving at a conclusion step by step. But if the first thought was accepted without question, everything that follows is built on that same foundation. And because each step connects to the next, it feels convincing. It feels like something that makes sense, something that holds together, something that must be true because it flows logically. But the logic itself is constructed. It's shaped by your brain's tendency to create coherence, to link ideas in a way that feels consistent, and that coherence can exist even when the underlying thought is not accurate. So the chain feels strong, not because it's correct, but because it is continuous. Another reason belief feels automatic is because your brain is constantly trying to reduce uncertainty. It prefers clear interpretations over ambiguity. So when a thought appears, especially one that leaves something unresolved, your brain moves quickly to define it, to give it a clear meaning. That clarity feels satisfying. It feels like understanding, like resolution. And because it reduces uncertainty, your brain is more likely to accept it without question. But that acceptance can happen too quickly. The interpretation may not be accurate, but it feels complete. And that feeling of completeness makes it seem reliable. So instead of leaving the thought open, your brain closes it. It assigns a meaning, locks it in, and moves forward as if that meaning is correct. And once that happens, everything that follows is shaped by that initial interpretation. This is how belief forms so quickly. Not through careful evaluation, but through the brain's need to resolve uncertainty as fast as possible. If you look closely, belief doesn't come from proof. It comes from how a thought is experienced. The more immediate, detailed, and emotionally aligned a thought feels, the more convincing it becomes. Your brain doesn't wait for external validation. It uses internal signals to decide what feels true. Those signals include familiarity, repetition, emotional intensity, and coherence. When a thought checks those boxes, it passes through your mind with very little resistance. It feels like something that makes sense, something that fits, something that belongs. And because it feels that way, your brain treats it as reliable. It doesn't pause to verify it against reality. It moves forward with it, building on it, integrating it into your perspective. This is why belief feels so natural. Because it's not based on careful analysis. It's based on how the thought feels when it appears. And that feeling is shaped by patterns your brain has already learned. So when a thought feels true, it's often because it matches those patterns, not because it has been tested. Your attention strengthens this process in a very direct way. The more time you spend on a thought, the more it develops, and the more developed it becomes, the more believable it feels. Attention acts like a magnifier. It takes something small and makes it feel larger, more defined, more significant. At first, a thought might appear briefly, without much weight, but if your attention stays with it even for a few seconds, it begins to grow. You start adding detail, imagining outcomes, connecting it to other ideas, and all of that makes it feel more complete. That completeness is what gives it credibility. It feels like something that has been thought through, something that holds together, something that deserves to be taken seriously. But that credibility is created by attention. It's not something the thought had when it first appeared. It's something that was built as you engaged with it. And because that process happens automatically, it feels like the thought was always that convincing, even though it became that way over time. There is also a subtle pressure in your mind to reach conclusions. Open-ended thoughts feel uncomfortable. They feel incomplete, unresolved, like something is missing. And your brain responds to that discomfort by trying to close the gap as quickly as possible. It takes a thought and pushes it toward an answer, an interpretation, a meaning that feels finished. And once that meaning is assigned, the thought no longer feels uncertain. It feels resolved. That resolution creates a sense of certainty, even when the conclusion itself hasn't been verified. It feels like something has been figured out, something has been understood, something has been decided, and because of that, the thought is accepted, not because it is accurate, but because it feels complete. And your brain prefers completeness over uncertainty, so belief forms as a way of closing the loop. It gives the thought a final shape, a sense of stability, even if that stability is based on an assumption rather than evidence. At this point, belief starts to feel like something automatic, something that happens without your input, and in many ways it is. The processes that generate thoughts, assign meaning, and create emotional responses all happen before you have time to intervene. So by the time you become aware of a thought, it already feels believable. It already carries a sense of truth, a sense of relevance, a sense of importance. And that makes it difficult to step back, because it doesn't feel like something that needs to be questioned. It feels like something that has already been understood. But once you begin to see how that process works, the experience starts to shift. You begin to notice how quickly belief attaches itself, how automatically it forms, how little space there is between the thought appearing and it feeling true, and in that awareness, a gap begins to open. A small space, where the thought can be seen before it, is fully believed. One of the most important things to notice is how quickly belief feels complete. It doesn't feel like something in progress. It feels finished, as if the thought arrived already confirmed, and that sense of completion removes the need to question it. Your brain prefers finished ideas over open ones. Something that feels settled is easier to work with than something uncertain. So when a thought appears, your brain moves quickly to give it that sense of completion, even if it means simplifying or assuming details that haven't been fully examined. That completion creates confidence. It makes the thought feel stable, like something that can be trusted, and once that confidence is there, your mind builds on it without hesitation. But that confidence is not proof. It's the result of your brain closing the loop too quickly. It's creating a sense of certainty where there may not be any, and because that happens automatically, belief feels immediate, even though it is being constructed in real time. There is also a reinforcement cycle that strengthens belief every time a thought is followed. When you engage with a thought, you're not just continuing it, you're confirming it. Your attention signals to your brain that this thought matters, that it deserves focus, that it should be maintained, and your brain responds to that signal by making the thought easier to access in the future. It strengthens the pathway, increases its availability, and prioritizes similar thoughts when your mind is free. Over time, this creates a pattern where certain thoughts appear more often and feel more believable simply because they have been reinforced. Not because they are accurate, but because they have been repeated and engaged with consistently. This is how belief becomes habitual. It stops being something that happens in response to individual thoughts and becomes something that happens automatically whenever certain patterns appear. And once that pattern is established, belief feels like the default, not a choice. Another layer is how your brain connects thoughts to past experiences. When a thought appears, it doesn't exist in isolation. It is immediately compared to memories, previous interpretations, and stored patterns, and those connections give it context. If a thought aligns with something you've experienced before, it feels more credible. It feels like something that has already been confirmed in some way, and that familiarity strengthens belief. But those connections are not always accurate. They are based on patterns your brain has learned, not necessarily on objective truth. And when your brain links a thought to those patterns, it creates a sense of validation that feels convincing. This is why certain thoughts feel like they must be true, because they seem to match something you already know. But what you know is often shaped by repetition and interpretation, not by direct verification, and that makes belief feel stronger than it actually is. What begins to change this pattern is recognizing that belief is something that happens after a thought appears, not something built into the thought itself. That distinction creates space. It separates the thought from the reaction that follows. When you see that separation, even briefly, the process becomes more visible. You notice the thought appearing, and then you notice the pull to believe it. And that pull is no longer invisible. It becomes something you can observe. That observation weakens the automatic nature of belief. It interrupts the sequence, even if only slightly, and that interruption is enough to change how the thought develops, because without immediate belief, the thought doesn't gain the same momentum. It doesn't expand as quickly, it doesn't feel as convincing, it doesn't take over in the same way, and that shift begins to change the entire experience of thinking. As this awareness builds, thoughts begin to feel different in a subtle but important way. They still appear, but they don't immediately carry the same authority. They don't feel like something that must be accepted or followed without question. Instead, they feel more like possibilities, something that can be considered, but not necessarily believed, and that difference reduces their impact. It creates a gap between the thought and your reaction to it. That gap gives you time, not to control the thought itself, but to decide how much attention it receives. And that decision changes how the thought evolves, because without full engagement, the thought doesn't build in the same way. It doesn't develop into a chain. It doesn't gain the same emotional weight. It doesn't become as convincing. And over time, that changes how your mind behaves as a whole. This doesn't mean thoughts stop feeling real or convincing immediately. The patterns that create that feeling have been reinforced over time, and they don't disappear all at once. But they begin to lose intensity. Thoughts still appear with detail and emotion, but they don't pull you in as quickly. They don't automatically become something you believe. They remain visible as thoughts, rather than turning into something that defines your experience. That shift reduces the pressure to respond. It removes the sense that every thought needs to be taken seriously. And without that pressure, your mind begins to settle in a different way. Not because it stops generating thoughts, but because those thoughts no longer dominate your attention in the same way. And that creates a more stable, less reactive mental state. What this ultimately shows is that belief is not something fixed. It is something that forms and strengthens through repetition, attention, and interpretation. And because of that, it can also change. The more you recognize how belief attaches to thoughts, the less automatic it becomes. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes more flexible, more responsive to awareness rather than just pattern, and that flexibility changes how your mind feels. Thoughts no longer carry the same immediate weight. They don't feel like something that has already been decided. They become something that can be seen, something that can be understood as part of a process, rather than something that defines what is true, and that understanding begins to shift the way you relate to your own thinking. And once that shift takes hold, even slightly, the experience of thinking begins to change in a noticeable way. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer feel like something you have to accept immediately. They don't feel like conclusions, they feel like starting points. That change reduces their intensity. It makes them easier to step back from, easier to observe, easier to let pass without fully engaging. And over time that becomes the new pattern. Not automatic belief, but awareness first, response second. a different sequence where the thought appears, and then there is space before anything else happens, and in that space the entire experience of your mind begins to shift, not because thoughts are controlled, but because belief is no longer automatic. And that is where real change begins.